This is Scott with CubeDocs. Today we're going to do a short demo which is telling a story of a few different use cases, and it'll show you a little bit about how the product is used, kind of a day in the life. We call this a Monday morning story, and as we go through it we're going to cover the integration of CubeDocs and planning analytics, workspace. We're going to discover a model. We're going to search for the root cause of a problem, and then we're going to plan our remediation. So let me switch over real quick to our environment. So we're going to start off, we'll start telling the story. What you're looking at now is Planning Analytics Workspace from IBM Cognos. And the story starts off with a finance analyst who comes into work on Monday morning, and her KPI reports aren't working. So what makes this story even a little bit more heartbreaking, I suppose, is that she knows that her normal developer is not in the office, and she doesn't know what she's going to do. She needs to get these reports out in a few hours for a big meeting, and so wringing her hands, she walks over to where the developers generally sit. So luckily there's another developer sitting there, and she asked the developer if they might be able to help out. And so this is kind of where the story starts off. So the developer says, well, yeah, I think I might be able to help. So he switches over to his workspace book for administration of documentation. And here he has kind of a view of the CubeDocs documentation and some server statistics, etc. And so he goes to start looking at the server to see if the server is kind of working. So he reviews some server statistics to make sure that there's, everything is operating in kind of normal parameters. He takes a look at some of the stats around cubes and the processes. Even rolls into and maybe looks at some usage stats and sees who might be working in the system. But in general, the server seems to be working, and he doesn't really learn much from this. All he knows is the KPI reports aren't working. So he says maybe we should pop into CubeDocs itself and look at the model and how your model's built. So he loads up the CubeDocs website right from within Workspace, and starts focusing on the various models. So each tile here represents a different model, and the particular model that we're having a problem with here is QD-Prod. So he goes ahead and clicks QD-Prod in order to view the documentation, and the most recent documentation is going to load up. And the first thing he sees is kind of an overview of the model. He can see the cubes and the dimensions and the processes and the chores. He's kind of trying to get an understanding of how this model hangs together. You can see down here a diagram of all the cubes and the flows between the different cubes. You can even click through and maybe look at a process view, just the processes and how they flow, or maybe just the rules, the cube rules and how they flow between the cubes. You can look at a view that has rules and processes. And one of the things that he notices here is that the PL detail cube appears to be missing. Now, he's never seen this model before in his life, and he thinks to himself, well, maybe that's the problem. So he goes ahead and he decides to investigate a little deeper. And by doing that, he goes ahead and digs into the PL cube itself. And here he can see right away that the PL cube is being loaded directly from the SQL data source with an ODBC connection. So again, he kind of looks through some of the different views, and one of his favorite views is rule and process, because it really shows a lot of detail about how that particular cube hangs together with the rest of the model, and where data comes from and where data writes to. And here we can see the all-important data load process, which is the PL and balance sheet from the FMIS, the Financial Management Information System. So here we're going to go ahead and load that, and as you notice, he goes through the process of loading different views and looking at different objects, a cube and different views of those cubes, and a process and different views of that process. You can even dive in and look at the script or the actual process itself and scroll through and review the code. If he has any questions, you could even load the definition for one of these functions, even all the way down to the data source query. So, he's really kind of been able to dive pretty deep in the documentation, but there's not much here that really helps him understand what is wrong. He just sees a model and how it hangs together, and it was a nice review, but it really hasn't helped much. So he asks the analyst, when was the last time it was working? And she says it was working just fine last week, but when I came in this morning, it wasn't. He goes, I've got an idea. Why don't we do a quick comparison? So we can compare last week to this week and see what changed. So what he does is he goes over to change analysis and loads up last week, loads up the current version, and he compares it to last week, and then runs the compare. Now the first thing he notices is some good news. There's hardly any change from last week to this week, but there is a small change, and that means that the area that he has to look through is much smaller. So he goes ahead and he loads to see what those changes are, and indeed that change was made in the KPI cube. So he goes ahead and he loads the detail for the KPI cube, and the first thing he notices is that there's been some changes to the cube rules. So he drills those changes out just so he can see a side-by-side view. And here we immediately see that there has been some code removed from the current version of the product. And that code actually is described in the description tags up there. And it looks like last week the TI process was loading the current and the prior period, but this week it's only loading the prior period. So immediately things are looking good. So he says to her, I think I found the problem. The reason your current data isn't loading is because somebody changed the load process. It looks like it's just a bit of code. If you'd like, I could roll back the TI process from last week, and we could rerun your reports and see if your data shows up. And she says, that would be great. He says, the only thing is, I'm just a little nervous about messing with other people's code. So, and I think it would probably be a pretty good idea if we went ahead and documented what we're about to do. And I also want to make sure I choose the right files because, sometimes, there's a lot of different files in there. It's easy to get the wrong one. So what he does is he chooses deployment planning. And deployment planning allows him to plan his deployment, but not just pick and choose files. He can actually see which files are from what date and what version, and he can also compare those files to see if they're different. So what he does is he goes ahead and he loads the current repository. This is the current version of production, and it's all the objects in production. And then he goes ahead and chooses his comparison, and we choose last week. And now what you'll notice is that we have the all-important change type column show up. And in the change column, most of these files say they're the same. Well, what he wants to do is only find the different files. And so when he chooses different, it filters all the way down to that one file. And he goes ahead and chooses that file, adds it to a deployment, gives it a name. I guess we'll just use mine. And says what he's doing. And then he goes ahead and he saves the deployment. Now that he's saved the deployment, he has an exact record of when he was rolling back, which file he was rolling back, from what environment and to which environment, and he's all ready to go to paste that file back in, or cut and paste that old file over the new, and restart the service, and away they go. So, thanks again for taking a look at our little video, and stay tuned for more from the CubeDocs channel. Thanks.